"The presence of lilies in October is either a tribute to modern horticulture," said Lord Peter Wimsey, adjusting his monocle, "or a symptom of moral decay." The remark, delivered in a drawling baritone to no one in particular, floated over the crumbling stones of St. Agatha's churchyard in Upper Beeding, where a clutch of villagers, thick-ankled women in sober tweeds and men in ill-fitted jackets, all trying not to gawk, were doing precisely that. Gawking. The corpse had been discovered early that morning by Mrs. Teasle, the rector's housekeeper, whose deaf spaniel had exhibited a rare moment of initiative by burrowing into the ivy-laced side of the church crypt. The scent, she declared with gratifying horror, was earthy but not ecclesiastical, and it had led directly to the body of Miss Iris Varden, pronounced with terrible appropriateness as Vardon, laid out as neatly as a communion wafer on the flagstones, her white dress barely soiled, and her corsage of lilies, unseasonal, yes, unnervingly fresh. Lord Peter had not come to Upper Beeding in search of death, although he had lately found it tended to follow him about, with something of the persistence of an unpaid tailor. He had been summoned, ironically, and with exquisite boredom, by his sister Mary, who, having recently undertaken the committee chairmanship of the Diocesan Society for the Preservation of Church Roofs, had declared that a fundraising fete in Sussex was not only desirable, but unavoidable. Wimsey, under duress and with the vague idea of sketching frescoes or inspecting tomb inscriptions, had assented. That had been Tuesday. Now it was Saturday morning, and Miss Varden, née Iris Parable, of the Chichester parables, was very much and quite definitely dead. "Strangled," muttered Chief Inspector Parker, kneeling beside the body. His face, faintly freckled and composed, bore the expression of a man resigned to his old friend's habits. "Not recent." "Hours, at least, by whom, one wonders," said Wimsey lightly, lighting a Turkish cigarette with one of those absurd little jet lighters that invariably fail in the wind but succeed in a churchyard. Parker rose. "She was to sing this evening at the vicarage. Mendelssohn, apparently. The rehearsal was last night. She never came home." "Ah," said Wimsey, exhaling a thin stream of smoke. "There is always Mendelssohn, so very fatal to sopranos." The village was already murmuring with theories. Suicide, unlikely. Her gloves were spotless. Accident, implausible. Corpses rarely arrange, themselves with botanical precision. Or love gone wrong, eminently plausible. The rector's nephew had been seen in what one villager called an unseemly pose behind the tea-tent only the week prior. Her voice, clear, bell-like, and disturbingly pure, had divided local opinion between angelic visitation and papist indulgence. She was admired, envied, and, most crucially, inconveniently, beautiful. "Whose idea?" asked Wimsey, crouching to inspect the corsage with a botanist's delicacy. "Was it to bury her in lilies?" "She wasn't buried," said Parker. "She was posed. Someone wanted it to look like a ritual." Said Wimsey, his gaze flicking toward the church door, oak, centuries old, and hung slightly askew. "Then either someone reads too much Byron, or they want us to think they do." He tapped the stone beside the corpse with his cane, eliciting a hollow note. "Empty vault?" asked Parker, brows lifting. "Not empty," said Wimsey with a slight smile. "Just too resonant for a woman who was, by all accounts, singularly silent about her past." At that moment, a shriek, not of terror, but of outrage, arose from the Lich Gate, where Lady Hermione Fanshawe, widow of Colonel Fanshawe, KCBOBE and lifelong bore, had arrived in a state of wide-brimmed indignation. I told the rector something like this would happen when he allowed amateur theatricals in a house of God. "She would make a fine witness," Wimsey murmured to Parker, "assuming one filters out 90% of what she says." "Will you stay?" asked Parker. "My dear Charles," said Wimsey, turning his face toward the lowering clouds with the wistfulness of an overeducated hound, I have nothing to do, nowhere to be, and every inclination to poke about. A woman with lilies in her hand and secrets in her throat. How could I possibly resist? He straightened, turned on his heel with languid grace, and began to stroll toward the vicarage, where the rehearsal had been scheduled. The tea was presumably cold, and the lies, he had no doubt, had only just begun. Lady Hermione Fanshaw's shrill protestations faded behind them as Lord Peter Wimsey and Chief Inspector Parker made their way through the winding path to the vicarage, a whitewashed Georgian box that had seen better paint and worse sermons. It was surrounded by an aggressively tamed garden where the rose bushes stood stiffly to attention like guests at a wedding who disapprove of the bride. The lawn had been trampled in patches, rehearsal footprints or something less innocent, and a forgotten music stand lay tipped beside a wrought iron bench as though the arts had taken fright and fled. Wimsey paused to stoop and pick up a solitary glove, long, pale, and unmistakably feminine. He held it between two fingers as delicately as one might handle a diplomatic telegram from a hostile nation. "Left hand," he remarked, "custom-made. No name stitched in, the sort of glove a woman wears to feel mysterious, not warm." Parker eyed it. "I'll have it bagged and looked at." "Yes, do. I suspect it hasn't been lying here long. There's no dew on it. Either our soprano left it on the night of her disappearance, or someone dropped it this morning to mislead us." The vicarage door creaked open to reveal a woman with the kind of face that had been born old and made no apology for it. Miss Petra Gorst, the vicar's spinster cousin and housekeeper, regarded them through pince-nez with the long-suffering expression of one forced to endure both sinners and their accusers. "Detective gentlemen," she said with cool civility, "you'd best come in. The Reverend's in the study, praying over his sermon. He asked not to be disturbed. I imagine this counts as an exception." Inside, the vicarage smelt faintly of beeswax, old books, and talcum powder. The furniture was ecclesiastical in its uprightness, and a slight melancholy clung to the drapes. Wimsey brushed past a cabinet of porcelain angels and eyed a framed copy of Pilgrim's Progress with something like suspicion. Petra led them to a sitting room where several chairs had been pushed aside to make space for what had evidently been last night's impromptu choral rehearsal. Sheet music lay scattered, a jug of water sat half empty on a tray, and a single chair stood apart from the rest, its cushions indented. "This was Miss Varden's seat?" asked Wimsey, already knowing the answer. "Of course. She insisted on it, said she could see the metronome better from that angle. Always very particular about things like that." Wimsey ran a finger along the back of the chair. "Indeed. Singers often are." Fascinated by rhythm, breath, and the illusion of order, Parker picked up one of the music sheets and frowned. "Oh, for the wings of a dove," he read aloud. "Bit sentimental." "She sang it like it meant something," said Petra, with a sudden, brittle note. "I don't pretend to understand what that girl thought of when she sang, but it wasn't angels and heavenly peace, I'll tell you that." Wimsey glanced at her. "Do go on, Miss Gorst." Petra gave a sharp sniff. "I've kept house here 23 years, seen every variety of rector, curate, and over-pious widow, but I've never seen a face like that girl's. Not here. She was clever in a sly way, always half smiling, spoke very prettily but not often, knew she was beautiful and used it without ever saying so." "Did she have friends in the village?" "None I'd call friends." Women resented her. Men stared. "She lived in the cottage on the green. Small place, belonged to the trust. Came here 6 months ago with a note from the bishop's office saying she was to assist in musical education. We took her on. The vicar is a trusting soul, and was the vicar appreciative?" Petra's mouth became a firm line. "He is a man of the cloth." He admired her voice. "That's all I'll say." Parker, who had been making notes with the detached air of a man well accustomed to hearing more than he wished, tucked his pencil behind his ear. "Who attended last night's rehearsal?" Petra ticked them off with the efficiency of a schoolmistress. Myself, of course. I play the piano. The vicar. His nephew James, who has a passable tenor. Lady Hermione came late, insisted on adding a reading. Mr. Phelps from the hardware shop. He sings bass badly, but with great enthusiasm. And Iris, all accounted for. She left first, said she had a headache and needed to walk off the migraine. Alone? Asked Whimsy. So she claimed. And no one saw her after that? Not to my knowledge. Petra gave a look which suggested that knowledge not accompanied by proof was as good as fiction, though Lady Hermione muttered something about seeing her silhouette in the graveyard after dusk. But that woman sees ghosts every Thursday. Whimsy smiled faintly. One wonders whether the ghosts have tried objecting. Petra, unmoved by levity, excused herself to fetch tea. Whimsy stood by the window, peering out across the path to the graveyard, his profile sharp against the pale light. I don't like it, Charles, he said quietly. The symmetry is too perfect. Fresh lilies, white dress, rehearsal the night before. A village of people who claim not to know her, yet all seem vaguely indignant about her death. Parker joined him. Jealousy? Misplaced infatuation? Possibly. Or something older. She was here 6 months, and yet no one knows where she came from. Hasn't anyone asked? The bishop's office vouched for her. Indeed. I shall ring them, but in the meantime, let's walk to the cottage. I want to see how a girl with such modest means could afford lilies in October, and why she kept a corsage at all, for a mere church recital. The cottage on the green was modest, only in the architectural sense. The curtains were expensive, heavy damask. The doorbell, though cracked, gave off the tinkle of old wealth. Inside, the small sitting room bore the curious scent of faded perfume and well-thumbed volumes of French poetry. On a small table lay a compact mirror and a bundle of letters tied with blue silk ribbon. None addressed, all opened. Parker glanced through the top one. Poetry. Baudelaire. Badly translated, Whimsy moved to the mantel where a clock stood, ticking a full 38 seconds slow. He did not correct it. She performed here too, he said. Note the music stand in the corner, and the acoustics, lovely echoes from the beams. She wasn't just singing for the church, she was rehearsing something else. He picked up a photograph in a silver frame, an older man, unsmiling, with a priest's collar and a face carved from granite. Not local, Parker said. No one I recognize. No, said Whimsy. Nor I, but she kept him close, whoever he was. And she looked up to him. See the way the photos worn on the corners, thumbed often. Reverence, not romance. Parker nodded. We'll have the photo circulated. Whimsy gave a small hum. Do. And we must trace those lilies. Grown in hothouses, if I'm not mistaken, and quite dear. That corsage wasn't made for the vicarage parlour he knelt to, examined the fireplace. Ash, mostly grey, but there, nestled beneath a scrap of scorched envelope, was a metal pendant, small and oval, bearing the faint design of an Ouroboros, the snake devouring its tail. Now what have we here? Whimsy murmured. Symbol of eternity, popular with certain obscure societies, or perhaps just a dramatic trinket. He dropped it into a handkerchief. We'll take a closer look. But Charles, someone went to a great deal of trouble to make this death look poetic, which usually means the motive is anything but. Parker was silent for a moment. You think the killer staged it deliberately? To evoke something? Whimsy smiled without mirth. No one leaves a corsage fresh in a crypt by accident. Someone wanted to send a message. The question is, to whom? They turned to leave. As they stepped into the crisp air, the bells of St. Agatha's began to toll, not for a service, but for the time. 7 slow chimes. Whimsy cocked his head, considering. Odd, he murmured. She left rehearsal shortly before 8. And yet, this clock here is set deliberately slow. Someone tampered with it, asked Parker. Or relied on it, Whimsy replied. For an alibi, perhaps. He looked back at the cottage one last time. She walked away from this house alive, Charles. But someone else knew exactly when she'd be alone. Let's find out who. And with that, they stepped into the deepening dusk, where secrets, like lilies, bloomed in the strangest places. The next morning dawned a peculiar blend of mist and reluctant sunlight, the kind of weather that seemed to hover indecisively, neither committing to the brightness nor succumbing fully to the gloom. Lord Peter Whimsy found it an apt metaphor for the day's prospects as he and Chief Inspector Parker returned to St. Agatha's, this time with a renewed purpose. The village, still buzzing with whispered theories and half-formed suspicions, presented its usual collection of polite faces and careful glances, but beneath it all there was an undercurrent of something far less civil. Their first call was the rectory, where the Reverend Anselm Jowett awaited them in his study, a small book-lined chamber cluttered with theological treatises and yellowing sermon notes. The man looked as if he had not slept, his clerical collar slightly askew and a pinched expression of guilt, or perhaps exhaustion, etched deeply around his eyes. Mr. Whimsy, Inspector, he greeted with formal politeness that masked a certain frailty. This tragedy has shaken us all. Iris was a blessing of sorts, though no one here knew quite how to handle her. Whimsy, ever the master of disarming charm, inclined his head. A blessing is rarely wrapped in a neat parcel, Reverend. Pray tell me about last night's rehearsal. Who arrived and departed, and at what time? The vicar sighed and pushed back a stray lock of greying hair. Miss Varden arrived promptly at 6, as did the others. We sang through Mendelssohn, some hymns, and finally, "O for the Wings of a Dove" as a sort of benediction. Lady Hermione left early, around 7:30, to prepare for the village luncheon. James Jowett, my nephew, left shortly after, citing a pressing engagement in Brighton. Whimsy exchanged a glance with Parker, who made a discreet note. And Miss Varden? She left when? As Miss Gorst mentioned, she complained of a headache and said she would take a walk to clear it before dinner. She departed alone around 8 o'clock, or so I assumed. A solitary stroll, then, said Whimsy, tapping his cane against the floor. Did anyone see her after that? The vicar's eyes darkened. No one, I'm afraid. But I cannot imagine anything untoward occurring. Upper Beeding is a quiet place. Quiet enough for a murderer, sometimes, Parker muttered. Whimsy raised an eyebrow, but let the comment pass. And the clocks? I noticed the clock in Miss Varden's cottage runs slow. Yes, said the vicar. The cottage clock has been faulty for some weeks. I meant to repair it, but, well, it's a minor concern. Whimsy smiled faintly. Minor concerns often prove the most interesting, Reverend. May I ask if all other clocks in the vicarage and church are correct? The vicar nodded. To my knowledge, yes. The church clock is maintained meticulously by Mr. Phelps from the hardware shop. He's very proud of it, Mr. Phelps, Whimsy mused, a man of punctual habits, one suspects. Indeed, he sees to the mechanism weekly, a man of great care. Careful men make the best suspects, Whimsy observed, to Parker's quiet amusement. Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp rap at the door. Miss Petra Gorst entered, a pot of tea in hand, and a look that combined practical concern with simmering disapproval. "Excuse me, Reverend," she said briskly. "I thought you might like a cup. And perhaps our visitors would care." The vicar's lips twitched in gratitude as Petra poured the tea, and Whimsy took a moment to observe her. Her posture was stiff, her eyes keen, and her hands, though steady, betrayed a slight tremor, the kind of tremor born not of age, but of restrained emotion. "Miss Gorst," Whimsy began, "you mentioned yesterday that Iris was clever and sly." Did she ever confide in you about her past or her intentions here? Petra glanced briefly at the vicar before replying. She was secretive, yes, but never unkind. She hinted at having escaped something, an unhappy home, perhaps. She said music was her refuge, though I sensed it was also a shield. A refuge and a shield, Whimsy repeated softly. Sounds like a woman with enemies, even if unseen. Petra nodded. Or perhaps enemies she feared. The inspector shifted in his chair. Has anyone here a grievance against her? Any recent quarrels or disagreements? Petra's eyes flashed. There was the matter of the lilies. Several villagers were upset by her insistence on using exotic flowers for the church recital. Said it was vanity, said it was unseemly. Lady Hermione, in particular, Whimsy's mouth twitched with ironic amusement. Vanity in a soprano is hardly a surprise, but flowers in October are, as I mentioned earlier, a curious detail. He tapped his cigarette against the rim of the teacup and continued. Miss Gorst, did Iris have visitors at the cottage? Anyone coming or going unexpectedly? None I saw. Except for a tall man in a dark coat who visited once, briefly. She was nervous afterward. Tall, dark coat, and nervous, Whimsy mused. Descriptions delightfully vague. After a pause, he stood and moved to the window. The mist was lifting, revealing the neat hedgerows and the village green beyond. I should inspect this mysterious visitor's arrival in the village records. Meanwhile, Charles, I propose we visit Mr. Phelps at the hardware shop. If the church clock is involved, he may have something to say. Outside, the village stirred with the quiet hum of daily routines. The hardware shop was a narrow building, cluttered and fragrant with oil and metal. Mr. Phelps was behind the counter, a stocky man with a ruddy complexion and the manner of someone used to both pride and suspicion. Inspector Lord Peter, he greeted with a nod. Heard about Miss Varden? Terrible business. Yes, Mr. Phelps, Whimsy began. I understand you maintain the church clock? That's right. Every Tuesday, without fail, and last night. Was the clock running true? Phelps hesitated, then shook his head. It stopped. Not just a slow tick. Stopped cold at 8:20, Parker noted. Miss Varden was last seen around 8 o'clock, correct? Exactly, Phelps confirmed. I fixed it this morning, but last night it was out. Whimsy's eyes gleamed with interest. Did you inform the vicar? No, sir. Thought it might be a fluke. Besides, I've been busy with other repairs. The inspector frowned. The timing is curious. Whimsy nodded. Indeed. A stopped clock can provide an alibi or an opportunity. It tells us someone was familiar with the clock's quirks. Perhaps someone who wanted the village to believe a different time was in force. Parker turned to the door. I think we'll need to speak to Lady Hermione Fanshawe next. Before they could leave, the shop bell tinkled and a slender man entered, a stranger to the village, by his dress and manner. He introduced himself as Mr. Edmund Lark, a solicitor from Chichester, with an urgent interest in the Varden case. I've come on behalf of Miss Varden's family, he explained. There are legal matters that need attention, wills, trusts, and other papers. May I see the cottage? Whimsy regarded him coolly. You are a recent acquaintance. Only in the past few days, Lark admitted. But I have reason to believe Miss Varden's affairs are not as straightforward as they appear. Parker's eyes narrowed. And what reasons might those be, Mr. Lark? Let's say there are questions about her identity and certain documents that may have been altered or suppressed. Whimsy felt the familiar thrill of a puzzle deepening. Most intriguing. We shall accompany you, of course. Outside, as the sun climbed higher, the village seemed less benign. The shadows lengthened in odd places, and the gossip took on a sharper edge. Every glance was a question, every silence a withheld confession. Whimsy lit another cigarette, flicked ash thoughtfully, and said, Charles, I suspect our soprano's secret life is beginning to unravel. It may be that the lilies were the least of her curiosities. Parker gave a tired smile. Let's hope the next scene is less theatrical and more truthful. As they walked toward the cottage once more, the clock in the church tower tolled again, slow and deliberate, marking a time that, like the truth, remained just out of reach. The air inside Miss Varden's cottage carried the faint, persistent scent of lilies, a floral perfume that seemed to linger in the corners, stubborn and incongruous amid the sparse furnishings and the faint mustiness of long-closed windows. As Lord Peter Wimsey, Chief Inspector Parker, and Mr. Edmund Lark crossed the threshold once again, the atmosphere felt charged, as though the walls themselves bore silent witness to secrets that refused to be laid to rest. Lark moved purposefully through the small sitting room, his eyes scanning the shelves, the desk cluttered with music sheets, and the mantelpiece where a fresh corsage still lay, its petals pristine, as though time had been paused at the moment of tragedy. He paused by the desk, carefully lifting a stack of papers bound with a faded blue ribbon. Miss Varden was meticulous, Lark murmured. But these documents suggest there was much she wished to conceal. He opened a folder containing correspondence, some addressed to a Miss I. Varden, others bearing a different name altogether, Isabel Fairfax. Wimsey's interest was piqued. A dual identity, then. Fascinating, and not uncommon in cases where the past weighs heavily upon the present. Parker bent over the papers. Anything here that could explain motive, or the peculiar nature of her death? Lark shook his head. Nothing explicit, but the references to financial settlements, to estranged relatives, and to a property in Sussex imply complexity beyond the surface. Wimsey fingered a letter, noting the fine script and the formal tone. Miss Fairfax writes of a desire to start anew, but fears unresolved matters may catch her unawares. An apprehensive woman, perhaps, or one pursued by ghosts of her own making, Parker remarked dryly. Wimsey's gaze swept the room, lingering on a small framed photograph atop the mantel. The image showed a younger Isabel, vibrant and smiling, flanked by two stern-faced men, one in a naval uniform, the other in plain tweeds. Family, no doubt, he mused aloud. Could these be the estranged relatives mentioned? Parker asked. Possibly. It would be prudent to locate them. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Petra Gorst entered, cheeks flushed from the cold, eyes sharp as ever. "I thought you might want to see this," she said, extending a small scrap of paper. Wimsey took it gingerly. A receipt dated the day before, from a florist in Brighton. It was itemized for an elaborate corsage of lilies, orchids, and ivy, signed with the initials I.V. "Interesting," Wimsey said. "The corsage was ordered yesterday, yet it was fresh this morning when the body was found." Someone planned carefully. Petra's voice was low. "I heard talk last night that Lady Hermione was seen near the florist's. She denies it, but the timing doesn't add up." Parker frowned. Another wrinkle. Wimsey tapped his cane. "The lilies, the corsage, the florist, these are threads, each pulling at a different part of the fabric. We must follow them all." Turning to Lark, he said, "Have you been able to verify Miss Varden's background?" Lark nodded. "I have made inquiries with the registry in London. It seems Miss Fairfax legally changed her name to Varden 3 years ago. Before that, she was involved in a protracted dispute over a family estate, one that her uncle, a Colonel Fairfax, evidently contested bitterly." Wimsey raised an eyebrow. "Colonel Fairfax, you say?" "Perhaps the gentleman in the photograph." "Exactly. And Colonel Fairfax has been visiting Sussex frequently, though none here seem to know why." "Visits shrouded in secrecy," Wimsey muttered. "One can only assume he had a vested interest in the matter." Parker glanced at the clock on the wall. "We need to establish a precise timeline for yesterday evening. Miss Varden's last movements, Lady Hermione's whereabouts, Colonel Fairfax's visit, everything. Whimsy smiled faintly. Yes, Charles. The devil is in the details. The trio left the cottage, stepping into the crisp afternoon, the sun now higher, but the mist still clinging to the distant hills. Their next destination was the village post office, where Miss Hilda Phelps, Mr. Phelps' wife, was said to keep careful watch over local comings and goings. Hilda was a petite woman with sharp eyes and a habit of knitting perpetually, as though any moment of stillness might unravel her tightly wound nerves. She greeted them with a polite but guarded smile. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. How may I assist?" Whimsy produced a photograph of Miss Varden. "Miss Phelps, we understand you were acquainted with Miss Varden." She nodded slowly. "Yes, though we didn't see much of her. She was private, keeping to herself. Did you notice anything unusual yesterday evening? Visitors, departures?" Hilda hesitated. "Well, there was a man who came in just after 7, asked for directions to the vicarage. Tall fellow, dark coat. Left quickly. Didn't say much." Whimsy's lips twitched. "The same stranger Miss Gorst mentioned." "Yes," Hilda agreed. "And then there was Lady Hermione. She came in around 6, looking flustered. Bought a telegram form, but didn't send anything." "Flustered, you say?" Parker asked. "Very." She seemed upset about something. Whimsy pondered this. "We have a pattern emerging. A tall man, a flustered lady, and a stopped clock. All points converging on a tangled evening." The postmistress added, "There's also talk of Colonel Fairfax arriving in the village late afternoon, but he was seen leaving before 8. "Ah," said Whimsy. "That fits uneasily with the timeline, given Miss Varden's disappearance." They thanked Miss Phelps and moved on to the hardware shop once more. Mr. Phelps, adjusting his spectacles, was eager to share what he had noticed. "I thought of something last night," he said, "about the church clock. When it stopped at 8:20, it was near the hour when the bells toll. But they did ring, though faintly." "How can the bells toll if the clock is stopped?" Parker asked. "Exactly my thought, sir. I went to check the mechanism this morning. The clock's hands were still, but the bell striker was working, just not loud enough to be heard outside." Whimsy's eyes gleamed. A deliberate muffling. Someone wanted to simulate the passage of time without the full tolling. To mask an event, he turned to Parker. "We must inspect the belfry and the clock room. There may be evidence overlooked." Climbing the narrow, creaking staircase to the clock chamber, Whimsy's gaze swept the ancient gears and levers. He pointed to a thin piece of cloth, lodged near the striker. "Here," he said, "a silencer." A piece of velvet, likely slipped into place to muffle the bell. Someone with access to the tower and knowledge of its workings. Parker frowned. Who could that be? "The vicar, the sexton, or a visitor with a secret purpose," Whimsy replied. "Or all three." Descending, the detective turned thoughtful. "Charles, the timelines are closing in. Colonel Fairfax's movements, Lady Hermione's agitation, the stranger's appearance, and Miss Varden's dual identity form a web. But the web is not yet complete." Back outside, the wind carried a chill and the distant toll of an unmuted clock, echoing the slow unraveling of a mystery that seemed less about death and more about the desperate preservation of secrets. Whimsy lit a cigarette, watching the smoke curl and drift like the fragments of truth. "We must now confront Lady Hermione. There is something she hides, and the lilies are only the first thorn." Parker nodded. "I've no doubt she'll prove an interesting interview." As they walked toward Fanshawe Manor, the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows over the village. In the gathering dusk, the world seemed poised on the edge of revelation or deeper darkness. The dusk that wrapped Fanshawe Manor in a cool, lavender haze did little to soften the austere silhouette of its gables and chimneys. Lady Hermione awaited them in the drawing-room, a pale figure behind a screen of delicate lace curtains. The room's heavy damask and polished wood seemed almost incongruous against the faint tremor in her voice as she rose to greet Lord Peter Wimsey, Chief Inspector Parker, and Mr. Edmund Lark. Her eyes were wide, yet guarded. The perfumed air felt heavy with unspoken burdens. "Lord Peter, how very good of you to call again," she murmured, her voice laced with brittle civility. "I confess, the events have left me rather unsettled." Wimsey inclined his head slightly, his expression as inscrutable as ever. "Lady Hermione, you seem burdened by more than the tragedy alone. Might we trouble you for your recollection of yesterday evening's occurrences?" She hesitated, fingers tightening on the arms of her chair. "Certainly. I was at home most of the afternoon, attending to letters and the house arrangements. Around 6, I stepped out briefly to visit the florist, as I mentioned, but I assure you I never left the village afterward." "Yet you were seen at the post office, purchasing a telegram form," Parker interjected quietly. Her composure flickered. I did go to the post office to send a message, but I was interrupted." Wimsey's lips quirked. "Interrupted, you say? Intriguing. By whom?" "A stranger," she admitted, eyes darting toward the window as if seeking escape. "A tall man in a dark coat." He seemed urgent. "Did you speak with him?" Wimsey pressed. "No. He asked for directions to the vicarage and left hastily." She swallowed. "I did not see him again." "Did you know this man?" Lark asked. "No," she said firmly, but I felt an unshakable unease, almost as if he were watching Wimsey considered her carefully. "Lady Hermione, do you mind if we ask about your relationship with Miss Varden?" A shadow crossed her face. "We were acquaintances, nothing more. Miss Varden was a private person, somewhat distant even within the village, and yet you visited the florist the same day she ordered her corsage," Wimsey observed. "Coincidence or something else?" Lady Hermione's eyes glimmered with unshed tears. "I admit I was concerned. Miss Varden had been troubled, especially by family matters. There were rumors about her uncle, Colonel Fairfax." Wimsey nodded. "Indeed, and he was seen arriving late afternoon, then departing before 8. If the clock in the village stopped at 8:20 and the bells were muffled, then there is a narrow window during which Miss Varden's fate was sealed." "Did you see Colonel Fairfax yourself?" Parker inquired. "No, but his presence cast a long shadow. I overheard him speaking sharply on the telephone at the vicarage." "The vicar?" Wimsey asked. "Was he aware of Miss Varden's predicament?" Lady Hermione gave a faint, bitter smile. "The Reverend Goodwin is a man of discretion, but he knows more than he admits. He has been protective of the village's reputation. Protection often veils secrets," Wimsey remarked dryly. The detective's gaze sharpened as he asked, "May we speak with the Reverend?" Lady Hermione hesitated before nodding. "I will arrange it." As they prepared to leave, Parker caught sight of the corsage, now resting on a silver salver in the corner of the room. The lilies and orchids gleamed almost defiantly, as though challenging the gloom. "May I?" Wimsey asked, lifting the delicate flowers carefully. He inhaled their subtle fragrance. Fresh as when Miss Varden wore them. "Someone brought these here." An intimate gesture or a signpost, Lady Hermione watched him silently, the tension in the room thickening. The vicarage was a modest building, its whitewashed walls and tidy garden belying the complex social undercurrents within. Reverend Goodwin greeted them with a reserved smile, his eyes betraying an intelligence beneath the benign exterior. "Lord Peter, Chief Inspector, you honor us. I hear you have grave questions." "Indeed, Reverend," Wimsey replied. "Miss Varden's death has cast a pall not only over the village, but also the delicate fabric of its relations. We hope you may shed light on her final hours." Goodwin led them to his study, lined with books on theology, local history, and an assortment of hymnals. "I knew Isabel Fairfax, Miss Varden as she preferred," he began. She was a woman torn between two worlds. The past, represented by her uncle, Colonel Fairfax, and the present, her fragile attempts at peace here. "Did she confide in you?" Wimsey asked. "To some extent," the Reverend said. "She feared her uncle's influence, both financial and personal. He was a formidable man, capable of great charm but also of ruthless persistence." Parker leaned forward. "And the telephone call you were overheard making?" Goodwin's expression darkened slightly. "A matter of village concern. Colonel Fairfax was pressing for information, and I was advising caution." Wimsey's eyes twinkled. "So the vicar is the keeper of secrets, then?" "A fitting role." The Reverend smiled thinly. "We all have our roles, but I assure you, my interference was limited to preventing scandal, not concealing crime." "Yet someone muted the church bells last night," Wimsey observed, deliberately muffling the passage of time. Goodwin's eyes flickered with unease. "I did not hear the bells." "But the mechanism was tampered with," Wimsey pressed, "by someone with access and motive." "Surely not me," Goodwin said, voice low but firm. "Of course not," Wimsey said lightly. "But we must consider all possibilities." The vicar shifted uncomfortably. "I can say no more, I'm afraid." "The village thrives on discretion. Discretion can be a double-edged sword," Wimsey noted. As they left, Parker whispered, "There's more here than he's willing to say." Outside, the evening deepened, stars beginning to prick the sky like scattered diamonds. The air carried the distant murmur of the sea, a reminder of the vastness beyond this tangled web. Wimsey lit another cigarette, smoke curling around his thoughtful face. Colonel Fairfax's visits, Lady Hermione's agitation, the mysterious stranger, the silenced bells, all suggest a carefully orchestrated act. But to what end? Parker mused. Financial gain? Revenge? Perhaps a combination, Wimsey replied, and the key lies in the interplay of appearances and the reality hidden beneath. The corsage, the stopped clock, they are symbols, not just clues. Their next step was clear, to find Colonel Fairfax and confront the man whose presence haunted the village like a spectre. The shadows lengthened as they set off, each footstep echoing the slow ticking of time, an inexorable march toward truth. And somewhere in the silence, the lilies waited, their fresh petals a stark contrast to the decay beneath polished surfaces. Colonel Fairfax's estate lay just beyond the village boundaries, a grey stone house perched on a windswept knoll overlooking the churning sea. The fading light cast long shadows across the gravel drive, and as Lord Peter Wimsey's car crunched to a halt, the house loomed like a fortress guarding secrets too obstinate to yield easily. The butler, a gaunt man with a hawkish nose and eyes like chips of flint, opened the door before the summons could be given. "Colonel Fairfax is expecting you," he said curtly, leading them through a dimly lit hallway lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to follow every step. The colonel awaited them in the drawing room, a commanding figure despite the stoop in his shoulders and the faint tremor in his hands. His dark eyes gleamed beneath bushy brows as he regarded the visitors with a mixture of curiosity and thinly veiled suspicion. "Lord Peter Wimsey," he said with a nod, voice deep and deliberate. "And the others? To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" Wimsey returned the nod, noting the colonel's clenched jaw and restless fingers. "Colonel Fairfax, I trust you are aware of the tragic death of your niece, or rather, your ward, Isabel Fairfax, known here as Miss Varden." The colonel's expression hardened. "Yes, a deplorable business. I've been doing my utmost to assist the local authorities." Parker stepped forward. "We hope you will assist us further. Your visits to the village yesterday have raised questions, particularly concerning your movements during the evening hours." Fairfax's eyes narrowed. "I was in the village on business. The dispute over the estate is not concluded, and I'm not a man to be trifled with." Wimsey allowed a faint smile. Of course not, Colonel. But you must appreciate that your presence at certain times may prove critical to establishing the timeline. Which times precisely? Fairfax asked. Between 6 and 8 p.m., Parker supplied. The Colonel's gaze flicked momentarily to a clock on the mantelpiece, its hands frozen at 20 past 8. I was at the vicarage shortly before 7, negotiating terms. I left by 8, that is all. And did anyone see you leave? Wimsey asked. Only the Reverend Goodwin. And he is cooperative, Wimsey pressed. Fairfax's lip twitched. The Reverend has his own interests, but he is a man of principle. Wimsey's gaze sharpened. Speaking of interests, Colonel, what can you tell us about your relationship with Miss Varden? Financially and personally. The Colonel shifted, his voice lowering. She was entitled to a portion of the estate, but her claims were contested. I have no wish to quarrel with her memory, but I cannot relinquish what is rightfully mine. Was there friction between you two? Wimsey's tone was gentle but unyielding. None that I would dignify with acknowledgement, Fairfax said stiffly. Wimsey exchanged a glance with Parker and Lark. We understand that Miss Varden took steps to conceal her identity, changing her name and relocating here. An attempt to escape the past, Fairfax admitted grudgingly. But the past has a way of catching up. Wimsey leaned forward. Then it was no surprise she received a visit from a stranger yesterday evening? Fairfax's eyes narrowed. I know nothing of any stranger. Yet others have seen him, a tall man in dark clothing who sought directions to the vicarage, Parker interjected. Fairfax stood abruptly, the room seeming to contract with his sudden movement. I cannot speak to shadows and rumors. I am a soldier, not a conjurer. Wimsey remained seated, unmoved. And the corsage? Ordered from the florist in Brighton the day before, found fresh on Miss Varden's person? The Colonel's jaw tightened. A lady's adornment, it means little. But it is a thread in the tapestry, Colonel, Wimsey said softly. And it is one that ties into the muffled church bells. Fairfax's eyes flicked to the window, darkening with a storm barely contained. The bells. I heard nothing of their muting. Yet the clock stopped at 20 past 8, and the bell striker was deliberately muffled, Wimsey explained. Someone sought to disguise the precise moment of death. The Colonel's voice dropped to a growl. You imply I had a hand in this? Not yet, Wimsey replied with quiet certainty. But your proximity and interest warrant scrutiny. The tension was broken by the butler's entrance, announcing tea. Fairfax dismissed him with a wave, then sank back into his chair, eyes shadowed. We appreciate your candor, Wimsey said, standing. One final matter, the telephone calls the Reverend mentioned. Were you in contact with anyone yesterday evening? Fairfax's lips pressed into a thin line. I made one call, to my solicitor. Nothing more. And the solicitor? Unavailable. Wimsey exchanged a glance with Parker. We shall follow up. As they took their leave, the Colonel's parting words were curt. I expect justice, but I will not be accused without cause. Outside, the wind had risen, rattling the windows and carrying the faint sound of church bells, now tolling freely once more. Back in the village, Wimsey reflected on the layers of deceit and obligation tangled around Miss Varden's death. The Colonel's rigid posture and clipped answers suggested more than mere inheritance disputes. The presence of the mysterious stranger and the deliberate manipulation of time itself pointed to a carefully staged event. Lark, ever the practical mind, commented, the muffled bells, the stopped clock, the corsage, none of these are random. They are the instruments of a plan, a performance with a deadly finale. Wimsey nodded. Indeed, Edmund. The question remains, who orchestrated this play, and why? As night deepened, the detective's thoughts turned to Lady Hermione's nervousness, the vicar's evasions, and the elusive stranger. each a player on a stage of secrets and lies, bound together by human motives as old as the village itself. Fear, jealousy, and the desperate clinging to control. Whimsy's gaze drifted toward the window, where the moon cast pale light on the sleeping village. Somewhere within, the truth awaited, patient, hidden beneath layers of illusion. And so, Whimsy murmured to Parker, we prepare to watch the next act unfold. The morning sun filtered through the mist that clung to the village, lending Fanshawe a pallid, almost spectral quality. The usual bustle was muted, as if the villagers, conscious of the shadow cast by recent events, were moving in slow, careful rhythms. Lord Peter Whimsy found the atmosphere both oppressive and compelling. It was as though the very air conspired to keep its secrets well guarded. The morning's first task was a return visit to the florist's shop in Brighton, a modest, fragrant establishment filled with blooms that seemed impossibly fresh despite the early hour. Miss Patricia Crane, the proprietor, greeted them with a practiced smile that barely concealed her curiosity. "Mr. Whimsy, Chief Inspector," she said, nodding politely. "How can I assist you this morning?" Whimsy smiled in kind, the faintest arch of his brow betraying his ever-present amusement at the ordinary world's role in extraordinary events. "Miss Crane, I must trouble you regarding the corsage supplied to Miss Varden. Might you recall the circumstances of that particular order?" Patricia's eyes flickered briefly to the neat arrangement of lilies and orchids resting under a glass dome behind the counter. "Yes, I remember it well. The order came late afternoon, just yesterday, in fact. A lady came in, wearing gloves, quite elegantly dressed. She requested the corsage be prepared quickly. There was a certain urgency. Did she identify herself?" Whimsy queried. "No, she was quite discreet. Left in a hurry too, without paying." Parker frowned. "Unpaid? Was this common?" "Not at all. Usually customers settle immediately." I was surprised Whimsy's smile sharpened. "Curious indeed. And the corsage was collected?" "No, I kept it in case she returned, but no one came back." "Did she leave a name or any other identifying details?" "None." Whimsy noted this carefully. "The gloves, you say? Leather? Color? Black, quite fine. Thank you, Miss Crane. One last thing. Did anyone else visit the shop yesterday afternoon?" Patricia hesitated. "Yes, a man. Tall, dark hair, rather striking. He asked if a Miss Varden lived in Fanshawe. When I said I wasn't sure, he left quickly. He seemed agitated. The pieces began to form a pattern. A mysterious woman, gloves, an unpaid corsage, a stranger seeking Miss Varden. None coincidental." Back in Fanshawe, Whimsy arranged for a more detailed examination of the village clock tower, where the timepieces' stopped hands held the key to the night's fatal moments. The caretaker, an elderly gentleman named Mr. Hargrove, proved a willing accomplice, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Stopped at 8:20, you say?" he murmured, running a gnarled finger along the ironwork. "That is odd. The clock's mechanism is reliable. Always has been." "Someone must have interfered," Whimsy said. "Was there any disturbance in the tower last night?" Hargrove considered. "I heard footsteps about 9, but dismissed them as the postman or one of the villagers." "Footsteps near the clock at 9? Parker said sharply. "Yes, quite distinct." But no one reported anything unusual. Whimsy exchanged a look with Parker and Lark. Then we must find out who had access. The small village was a web of acquaintances and half-truths, and as the day unfolded, each interview added threads to the tapestry. Mrs. Whittaker, the housekeeper at Fanshawe Manor, revealed subtle tensions. Lady Hermione's secretive phone calls, the Colonel's brusque demands, and the vicar's insistence on propriety above all else. "Lady Hermione has been nervous these past weeks," Mrs. Whittaker confided, eyes darting as if fearing overhearing. "She spoke of old debts and family shadows." but no one pressed her. Whimsy filed this away, the phrase "family shadows" resonant with the vague dread that hung over the manor. The mystery deepened when the postmaster produced a telegram form, half completed and discarded in a wastebasket. The message was addressed to a Miss Varden, but only the words "meet at dusk" were legible. The rest had been torn away. "Who sent this?" Parker asked, perplexed. The postmaster shrugged. "No idea, but the handwriting is a woman's." Whimsy's gaze lingered on the torn paper. "A rendezvous at dusk. That places someone near the vicarage or the manor at a critical hour." Returning to the village green, Whimsy found himself drawn to the ancient stone church, its bells now ringing unimpeded, a sharp contrast to the muffled silence of the night before. He noticed, however, a subtle misalignment in the curtains of the vestry window, a detail easily overlooked. Peering through the glass, he discerned the faint outline of a small ladder and a heap of tangled ropes, apparently the bell ropes, an observation so trivial that no one else had remarked upon it. "This," Whimsy mused aloud, "is no accident." The muffling of the bells was deliberate, but clumsily executed. As he pondered, a shadow moved behind the stained glass, a figure retreating quickly from view. Without alerting the village, Whimsy noted the direction and made a mental note to investigate further. Later, at the vicarage, Reverend Goodwin received Whimsy and Parker with measured courtesy. The vicar's composure, however, seemed strained, his answers precise but lacking warmth. "I trust your inquiries are proceeding," he said, eyes flickering to the church bell tower visible through the window. "Indeed," Whimsy replied. "Might we speak of the bell ropes?" Goodwin's fingers tightened on the edge of his desk. "They were inspected this morning. Nothing amiss. Yet the muffling last night suggests otherwise," Whimsy said. "Did anyone have cause to silence the bells?" Goodwin's gaze faltered. "The bells mark time, but sometimes time must be bent to mercy's will." Whimsy raised an eyebrow. "A cryptic statement, Reverend." "Merely an observation on human frailty," Goodwin replied. "I have nothing further." As they left, Parker whispered, "He's hiding something." Whimsy nodded. "Indeed, Edmund. But the question is, what?" The day waned with no new revelations, but the undercurrents of the village's social fabric tightened around them. The mysterious stranger, the unpaid corsage, the stopped clock, and the muffled bells were all pieces of an intricate puzzle, each deliberately arranged. In the twilight, as Fanshawe prepared for night, Whimsy's thoughts turned inward, assembling the fragments with meticulous care. The arrival of the stranger and the secret rendezvous suggested a conspiracy rooted in fear and desperate hope. Yet beneath it all lay a darker truth, waiting to be unearthed, one that would force the village to confront the very nature of trust, betrayal, and the facades maintained with such painstaking effort. And as the final hour approached, Lord Peter Whimsy, ever the patient watcher, knew the stage was set for the unveiling of secrets long kept in shadow. The chill of the approaching evening settled over Fanshawe like a shroud, thickening the shadows and lending an almost tangible weight to the whispered secrets that fluttered behind closed doors. Lord Peter Whimsy, Parker, and Lark moved silently through the village, their footsteps muffled against the cobbles slick with early dew. The hour was late, well past the time when most respectable villagers had retreated to the relative safety of their homes, and yet this was precisely when the invisible clockwork of deceit began to tick with greater urgency. Their destination was the church tower, the locus of several peculiarities that had so far evaded full explanation. The stopped clock, the muffled bells, the disordered ropes, all hinted at interference. But why? And by whom? The answers, Whimsy suspected, would reveal much more than the mere mechanics of timekeeping. Mr. Hargrove, the elderly caretaker, awaited them at the base of the tower, his lined face lit by the flickering flame of a lantern. "You're late," he murmured with a twinkle of dry humor. "But the evening's quiet, and the village sleeps." "Quiet, yes," Whimsy replied. "But quiet can be deceptive." They ascended the narrow spiral staircase, the walls damp and lined with moss, the air thick with dust and the faint scent of beeswax from long-extinguished candles. At the summit, the clock's ironworks lay exposed, its hands frozen at 8:20, as if time itself had conspired to halt the moment of tragedy. Whimsy knelt to examine the mechanism. "Notice here," he said, pointing to a small lever slightly out of alignment. "Someone has manually engaged the stop mechanism. This is not a fault, but a deliberate act." "Who would want to stop the clock?" Parker asked, voice low. "To obscure the exact time of death," Whimsy replied. "But that is only part of the riddle. Look at the bell ropes." He gestured to the tangled cluster beside the window. "They've been tied back and muffled with cloth, dampened to silence the peals that should have rung out." Hargrove nodded gravely. "A strange thing indeed. But only a fool would think such acts would go unnoticed." Whimsy's smile was thin and unamused. "Ah, but the fool is often the last to realize the game being played." As they descended, the flicker of lantern light caught a glint of metal near a loose stone. Parker picked it up. A slender, ornate hairpin, delicate yet unmistakably valuable. "Found this near the ropes," he said. "Could belong to the lady who ordered the corsage." Whimsy held it up, examining the craftsmanship. An item of elegance in a place of shadows. Curious. Outside, the evening deepened, and they moved on to the vicarage, where Reverend Goodwin awaited with the stiff formality of a man accustomed to control. Yet beneath his composed exterior lay a subtle agitation, a tightness in the jaw, the brief flicker of darting eyes. Whimsy opened with deliberate civility. "Reverend, might I trouble you on the matter of your whereabouts between 6 and 8 yesterday evening?" Goodwin's gaze sharpened. "I was engaged in parish duties and private study." Nothing untoward occurred. "Indeed," Whimsy said, arching a brow. "Yet a witness claims to have seen a figure leaving the churchyard around that time, a tall man, cloaked, moving swiftly." Goodwin's fingers tightened on the armrest. "Speculation can be dangerous." "True," Whimsy acknowledged. "But the presence of that figure aligns curiously with the muffled bells and stopped clock." The vicar's composure cracked momentarily. "I cannot say more. The village is a delicate balance." "And what of your telephone conversations?" Whimsy pressed. "Several calls were logged yesterday evening, some brief, some extended. Whom did you contact?" Goodwin hesitated, then spoke with a measured tone. "Matters concerning parish affairs and a family dispute." "It is not for me to disclose private conversations." Whimsy noted the evasion, but allowed it to pass. "Of course, Reverend. But the timing of those calls is of interest. I trust the matter of Miss Varden's estate is proceeding." Goodwin's eyes darkened. "It is a painful business. And yet Miss Varden was found here, not at the manor," Whimsy observed, suggesting she was estranged or perhaps in hiding. The vicar's answer was a taut silence. Later, in the fading light, Whimsy and his companions returned to the manor, where Lady Hermione awaited in the drawing-room. Her appearance was a study in controlled elegance, but her hands trembled slightly as she handed Whimsy a letter, delivered that afternoon from an anonymous sender. The letter was brief but chilling. "Truth is a rose with thorns, sharp enough to draw blood. Beware the corsage's bearer, for beneath the petals lies a poison most deadly." Whimsy folded the paper carefully, his mind racing. The metaphor was clear. The corsage was not merely a decorative flourish, but a symbol of the danger enfolding the village. Lady Hermione's voice was low, strained. "I fear for the safety of those I care for. There are forces here beyond mere mortal quarrels. Yet the answer lies in mortal motives," Whimsy replied gently. "Jealousy, greed, Fear, these are the true culprits." The conversation was interrupted by a sudden knock at the door. A breathless servant announced a visitor, a man who had arrived in town only that afternoon, claiming urgent business with the family. Whimsy regarded the newcomer with sharp eyes as the door opened. The man was tall and dark, his expression tense, his manner brusque. The same stranger from the florist's shop, no doubt. "Mr. Selwyn," Whimsy said, rising. "You have come at a most delicate moment." Selwyn nodded curtly. "I'm here to clear my name. I had no hand in Miss Varden's death." "Many claim innocence, Mr. Selwyn," Whimsy said, "but actions speak louder than words. Pray, enlighten us as to your purpose." Here Selwyn's eyes flicked briefly to Lady Hermione. "I sought to warn Miss Varden of a threat. She was in danger, and I wished to protect her." "From whom?" Parker demanded. Selwyn hesitated. "From within the family." Whimsy's smile was thin and ironic. Family is often the most dangerous place of all. As the evening wore on, the layers of pretense peeled back to reveal a network of rivalries, betrayals, and secret alliances. The mystery of the corsage, the muffled bells, the stopped clock, and the shadowy stranger began to coalesce into a pattern of calculated misdirection. Whimsy's mind pieced together the fragments, tracing the tangled chronology with relentless precision. The danger was not merely in the act itself, but in the intricate staging designed to confuse and mislead. And yet, the truth remained just beyond reach, a final act waiting to be performed under the watchful eyes of Fanshaw's silent houses. As the clock ticked inexorably toward midnight, Whimsy prepared to lay his trap, knowing that the next revelation would demand courage from all involved and might well unmask a darkness long concealed beneath the village's genteel surface. The gathering in the drawing room lingered like a fragile truce on the verge of collapse. The air was thick with unsaid accusations and the brittle politeness of those aware that the evening's revelations might tip the scales irreversibly. Lord Peter Whimsy, however, maintained an air of calm detachment, his arch smile scarcely masking the intensity of his thoughts as he surveyed the assembled company. "Mr. Selwyn," Whimsy began, seating himself with an ease that belied the scrutiny he was about to apply. "You say you wish to warn Miss Varden. Pray, when did you attempt this, and by what means?" Selwyn shifted uneasily, his eyes flicking toward Lady Hermione before settling on Whimsy's imperturbable gaze. "Yesterday afternoon, shortly after I returned to Fanshawe. I tried to find her at the manor, but she was not there. I followed her to the churchyard, but lost sight of her near the tower. I intended to seek her out later, but fate had other designs." "And did anyone witness this attempt to warn her?" Whimsy asked pointedly. Selwyn hesitated, then replied, "No one, I'm afraid." It was too discreet. But the ropes at the tower, the bell ropes, were disturbed, I saw that much. It seemed an odd thing. Whimsy nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed. Someone went to great lengths to silence the bells, to halt the clock, and yet these actions were plainly not concealed. A curious paradox, wouldn't you say?" Lady Hermione interjected quietly. "It was meant as a message." To whom, I do not know, Whimsy tapped a finger against the armrest, eyes narrowing. "A message that speaks in riddles. Miss Varden's death was no mere accident or crime of passion. It was theatre, carefully staged to mislead and to frighten." The mention of theatre drew a faint smile from Parker, who had been quietly observing. "I've heard whispers in the village. Miss Varden was no stranger to drama, it seems. Some say she harbored secrets best left buried." "Secrets," Whimsy echoed, "which often prove more lethal than poison or blade." At that moment, the door opened softly, admitting Miss Clarissa Pender, the vicar's niece and one of the few villagers who had remained aloof from the recent storm. Her presence brought a fresh air to the room, but also a sudden, sharp tension. "Lord Peter," she began, "there is something you must see." "I found it in the vicarage study." Whimsy rose. Curiosity piqued. "Lead the way, Miss Pender." The group followed her through the dimly lit corridors to the study, where a small desk lamp cast long shadows. On the desk lay a folded sheet of paper, hastily scrawled and stained with what appeared to be tears, or perhaps ink blurred by nervous hands. Whimsy unfolded the letter carefully. The writing was jagged, almost frantic. They watch and wait in silence. The corsage was never just a gift, but a token of control. Beware the man who walks in daylight but speaks with shadows. A murmur rippled through the group. Lady Hermione's face paled, and even Selwyn's expression darkened. "Who could this be referring to?" Parker asked. Whimsy's eyes were cold and calculating. The phrase, "man who walks in daylight but speaks with shadows," suggests duplicity. A double life, perhaps. Someone trusted, yet fundamentally deceitful. Could it be the vicar? Miss Pender ventured cautiously. "Perhaps," Whimsy said, "or someone close to him." He folded the letter and studied the assembled faces. We must look again at the events of yesterday with fresh eyes. The timelines, the movements, and the whispered conversations all require re-examination. With that, he turned to Parker. "Return to the manor and interview the servants once more. Pay particular attention to any discrepancies in their accounts and to the disposition of the corsage before the incident." Parker nodded and departed swiftly. Whimsy remained with the others, turning his attention to the vicar. "Reverend, I trust you have nothing further to conceal." Goodwin's jaw tightened. "I have been honest." "Honesty is measured by truth, not words alone," Whimsy said dryly. "We all have reasons for silence, but the shadows deepen when we refuse to illuminate." The Reverend said no more. Outside, the first hints of dawn began to pale the horizon as Whimsy and Miss Pender retraced steps through the village, noting the subtle signs that often escape the untrained eye. A misplaced shoe here, a hastily closed window there. Each detail was a piece of the grand puzzle, each a thread leading into the tangled web woven by human frailty and guile. Returning to the manor, Parker presented his findings. There is unease among the staff. Several swear they saw a figure moving through the west wing around the time of Miss Varden's death. An unusual visitor, perhaps even a family member concealed from general view. Whimsy's eyes gleamed. An intriguing possibility. Who among the family might move unseen, bearing a grudge or secret? Lady Hermione's lips tightened. "My nephew, Charles. He has been distant these past months, embroiled in debts and disapproved associations." "And his alibi?" Whimsy inquired. "Absent," she admitted. "He left for London that morning and claimed to have returned late in the evening, but no one can confirm." "Absent alibis are shadows in themselves," Whimsy mused. "A convenient blank canvas upon which guilt may be painted." "Yet," Parker added, "the manor's east wing had its own mysteries." The soundproof door to Miss Varden's room was found unlocked after the incident, though it is ordinarily secured. Whimsy pondered this. The unlocked door suggests a clandestine visitor or an escape route for the perpetrator. He rose and paced. The corsage remained central to this tale. It was fresh on the body but delivered hours before the time of death. Someone sought to create a false timeline, to mislead with floral deception. Selwyn, listening intently, interjected, "I saw Lady Hermione in the garden yesterday afternoon. She was speaking with a woman I did not recognize." "An outsider?" Whimsy asked. "Perhaps a governess or a companion?" But their conversation was hushed, urgent. Whimsy nodded, the pieces beginning to assemble in his mind like an intricate mosaic. "The play has more actors than we first suspected." The morning sun now flooded the room, illuminating the tension etched into every face. Whimsy's voice took on its final gravity. "We stand on the brink of revelation. The threads of deceit, jealousy, and desperation are woven tightly, but not beyond unraveling. Tonight, the truth shall be brought to light. not by superstition or guesswork, but by reason, observation, and the quiet persistence of the mind. As he spoke, the village of Fanshawe seemed to hold its breath, awaiting the closing act in this carefully choreographed drama, a drama in which no detail was trivial and every shadow might conceal a motive. The corsage was no longer just a flower, but a symbol, a cipher, a key to unlocking the dark heart beating beneath Fanshawe's genteel exterior. And Lord Peter Wimsey, with his arch wit and steely resolve, was prepared to wield it. The hours before dusk slipped by with a measured grace, as if the very air in Fanshawe village was waiting for Lord Peter Wimsey's final act. The drawing-room at the manor, once filled with anxious whispers and furtive glances, now hummed with a tension that only promises of revelation can create. Lady Hermione sat poised, yet visibly strained, her hands clenched around a delicate handkerchief embroidered with a pattern of forget-me-nots, ironically apt, given the circumstances. Wimsey, meanwhile, remained curiously inscrutable, his usual arch smile replaced by a countenance that bespoke of relentless cogitation. He moved with deliberate calm, occasionally jotting notes in a leather-bound notebook, his sharp eyes tracing the minutiae of the room, the placement of chairs, the subtle abrasions on the parquet floor, the very scent lingering in the heavy draperies. This was a man not content with surface appearances. His mind was a finely tuned instrument, attuned to the slightest discordance. The household had been summoned to witness what was, in effect, a staged unveiling. The police, eager to close the case with Selwyn as the scapegoat, watched with polite skepticism, their files already prepared for a swift conclusion. But Wimsey had promised something far more exacting, a resolution that would cut through artifice to the marrow of truth. He began with a dry, almost theatrical flourish. "My dear friends, we have been entertained by a most curious performance over the past several days. A drama rich with misdirection, half-truths, and floral enigmas. It would be tempting to attribute Miss Varden's untimely demise to the obvious suspects or to the neat villainy of jealousy. Yet, as with all good theatre, the true plot lies not in the opening acts, but in the subtle cues, the whispered lines, and the stagecraft." His gaze settled on Selwyn, who met it with a mixture of defiance and resignation. "Mr. Selwyn, you stand accused not because of evidence, but because of convenience. Your presence in the village, your less than perfect alibi. These are but the shadows cast by a more elaborate figure behind the scenes." The room shifted, eyes darting between the accused and the accuser. Wimsey continued, "Allow me to reconstruct the timeline as it must be understood, not in broad strokes, but in precise detail. Yesterday afternoon, Miss Varden received a corsage, fresh and fragrant, left at her door. The flowers, a particular variety of gardenia, were plucked no earlier than the morning hours, a fact confirmed by the keeper of the manor's greenhouses." He paused, letting the significance settle. Yet the corsage remained unworn until it was discovered upon her, arranged with care but at a time that does not coincide with the time of death established by the post-mortem examination. Here, he turned to Parker, who produced a small bundle from a drawer. "These are the gardener's records noting the precise times of delivery and retrieval of flowers that day. The data show that the corsage could not have been made before 10 in the morning. However, the fatal blow. Stab. Wounds inflicted by a knife found in the kitchen. Occurred shortly before sunset, a window during which several alibis falter." Wimsey's voice dropped to a near whisper. It was not merely a matter of opportunity, but of staging. The fresh corsage was a ruse designed to mislead, to draw attention away from the true perpetrator and the true moment of crime. The assembled guests exchanged glances, the air thick with anticipation. "Now," Wimsey resumed, "let us speak of the soundproof door to Miss Varden's chamber. It was found unlocked and ajar after the murder, though it is ordinarily kept secured at all times. This detail, seemingly trivial, is in fact pivotal. He turned to Lady Hermione, who nodded faintly in acknowledgement. Someone entered or exited through this door without arousing suspicion. Yet the servants attest to hearing no footsteps, no disturbance. The explanation lies in the door's unique construction. It leads directly to a small, seldom-used corridor where footsteps are muffled by thick carpets and heavy drapes. Whimsy gestured to the floor plan he had sketched earlier, tracing the route. The murderer took advantage of this passage to approach the victim unnoticed, to carry out the deed, and then to slip away with equal stealth. A ripple of unease passed through the room. "And now, for the motive," Whimsy said, voice sharp as a rapier. "We must consider not the outward appearances, debts, jealousies, or petty grudges, but the deeper psychological currents that swirl beneath the surface of polite society." He turned his gaze upon Lady Hermione, who met it with composed dignity. Miss Varden was privy to secrets that could have shattered the carefully constructed facades of this household. Her relationship with the vicar, far from benign, was marked by manipulation and control, a dance of power disguised beneath a veneer of civility. "Reverend Goodwin," Whimsy addressed the clergyman directly, "you and Miss Varden shared more than mere parish duties. The letter discovered by Miss Pender, with its warning of the man who walks in daylight but speaks with shadows, points to duplicity. You spoke in whispers. She was your confidant, yet also your victim." Goodwin's face hardened. "I have nothing to confess." "But you did try to silence her," Whimsy pressed. "The stopping of the clock, the silencing of the bell ropes, actions not merely symbolic but practical to mask the exact moment of death and delay discovery." The Reverend's eyes darted briefly, betraying a flicker of guilt before he composed himself. "Then there is Charles," Whimsy continued, turning to the absent nephew, who now stood in the doorway, pale and visibly shaken. "Your debts and absences might paint you as suspect, but in truth, you were unwittingly manipulated. Your late return was true, but you were misled by a forged letter, designed to provide you with an alibi and to draw suspicion elsewhere." Charles's hands trembled. "I swear I knew nothing of such schemes." "Yet the true architect of this tragedy is one who thrived in the shadows. The governess, Miss Langley," Whimsy announced, turning towards the woman who had remained silent, eyes downcast but sharp. "Your outward demureness concealed a calculating mind. You sought to protect your own interests and were prepared to eliminate Miss Varden, who threatened to expose you." Gasps echoed around the room. Whimsy detailed how Miss Langley had gained Miss Varden's trust only to betray it. The unlocked door was her entry point. The fresh corsage was her signature, a sinister calling card meant to confound investigators. The manipulation of the clock and bell ropes was her cunning attempt to create confusion over the timeline. Miss Langley's composure shattered. "You have no proof," she hissed. "Proof is in the pattern, Miss Langley," Whimsy replied coolly. "In the inconsistencies of your story, in the knowledge only the killer could possess, and in your fingerprints found on the bell ropes, which you claimed never to have touched." She faltered, then sank into a chair, defeated. The police moved swiftly to take her into custody, the theatrical farce finally drawing to a close. Whimsy turned to the remaining company, offering his characteristic wry smile. "Justice, like a well-constructed plot, demands patience and precision. Let us hope that in time the scars left by this tale may fade as readily as the scent of a gardenia's bloom." Lady Hermione sighed, relief mingled with sorrow. "Thank you, Lord Peter." For seeing through the shadows, Whimsy inclined his head. "The shadows always give themselves away in the end, madam." One need only know where to look as he prepared to depart. Cigar in hand and the hint of a classical quotation lingering on his lips, the village of Fanshawe exhaled its held breath, the Corsage's mystery finally laid bare. Its fresh petals a solemn reminder that beneath even the most genteel surfaces, darkness can bloom, only to be dispelled by the clear light of reason. The drawing-room had resumed its quiet, heavy atmosphere, the echoes of accusation and confession lingering like the fading notes of a sombre sonata. Lord Peter Wimsey, cigar poised delicately between two fingers, allowed himself a moment's repose, though his eyes retained that familiar gleam of cerebral satisfaction. "Miss Langley's unmasking," he began, "though momentous, is but the final thread in a tapestry woven long before any of us set foot in Fanshawe. It is the interplay of human frailty, envy, fear, ambition that choreographed this tragedy." He paced slowly, voice measured, choosing his words as if selecting from a rare collection of vintages. "Consider first the corsage, a seemingly innocuous floral token, yet here employed as a subtle misdirection. Its freshness was no accident, but a deliberate flourish, an attempt to anchor the time of death falsely. Miss Langley's access to the greenhouse records and her knowledge of the manor's routines enabled this ruse." Wimsey paused to meet each face around him, as if inviting their silent agreement. Then, the curious matter of the soundproof door, unlocked, left ajar, and seemingly forgotten. It was Miss Langley's secret passage, her clandestine route to the victim's chamber. The muffling carpets, the heavy drapes in the corridor, no ordinary visitor could have traversed that way unnoticed, yet she, intimately acquainted with the house's every creak and shadow, moved like a ghost. His gaze sharpened. Miss Varden's relationship with Reverend Goodwin was complex, certainly, but insufficient motive alone for murder. Rather, it was Miss Langley's fear of exposure, of losing her precarious position and, with it, control over the household's subtle hierarchies, that sealed her fate. Wimsey drew a deep breath, his tone adopting a note of quiet finality. Her manipulation extended to the silencing of the bell ropes and the stopping of the clock, tactics designed to distort the timeline and delay discovery. And when one examines the sequence of events closely, the forged letter sent to Charles to establish a false alibi, the footprints hidden beneath the thick corridor carpet, the faint scent of gardenia on her gloves, the entire fabric of deception unravels. He turned to Miss Langley, now pale and defeated. "You hoped to cloak your deed in shadows, but as I once remarked, even the darkest night must yield to dawn. Your calculated cruelty has been laid bare." Miss Langley's defiance crumbled, replaced by a weary acceptance. I only wanted to protect myself." "A truth as old as crime itself," Wimsey replied softly. "Yet protection built on betrayal and murder is a house of cards, destined to fall." The constable moved forward to take her into custody, the solemnity of justice restored. Lady Hermione stepped closer to Wimsey, gratitude shining in her eyes. "Your brilliance has saved us from a false accusation, Lord Peter. How can one ever repay such clarity?" Wimsey inclined his head with a faint smile. "By remembering, madam, that human nature is rarely as simple as a neat alibi or a single motive. The devil, as ever, is in the details, and in the courage to see them." He pocketed his notebook and prepared to leave, pausing at the threshold to cast one last glance at the manor. The sun had dipped lower, bathing Fanshawe in a golden light that softened its harsh edges. "Ah, to quote the bard himself," Wimsey mused aloud, "the web of our life is of a mingled yarn, good and ill together." This tale, like all good mysteries, reminds us that beneath the veneer of civility lies the complex and often contradictory heart of mankind. With that, Lord Peter Wimsey strode into the gathering dusk, leaving behind a village, restored yet forever altered, and a corsage's scent fading into memory, fresh no longer, but indelibly marked by truth.